All right, now we're going to move into sort of the middle part of the methodology lecture. Get that up here. And I'm not using PowerPoint on this one. I'm using the LibreOffice version, which is a free version on this particular computer. It's an open source Office suite program, a suite of programs. And it has a really good thing, meaning it's got a presenter screen that goes on at the same time, but it also blocks out my video screen. So my video control screen. So anyway, I have to start over from the beginning every time. I can't just have it halfway up when the thing starts. Okay, so bottom line, you're going to see me go through a bunch of stuff that we went through in the previous video. Take just a second. Okay, we left off on the ethics stuff. All right, this section, I'm going to try and abbreviate this quite a lot. There were a lot of stories in this, and they had to do with all the stuff on the list. And hang on, let me just go forward here, and I'm going to try to limit this one down really small. Okay, we'll get through the end of this first half, but I'm going to really cut through most of the stories in the interest of just getting you the stuff that you need for the exam. All right, so again, it was a long discussion. This took an entire course when I did it, and we're talking about September of 2021. I don't remember exactly which day, but I'll point that out when I post it. Right, and like I said, there are a bunch of stories in this. So points I wanted to make were, when you go out to do field work, there are a lot of things that can stop your research or interfere with it. Right? Physical danger is one of them. I'm not going to go through every single one of the stories, but I will hit the topics more or less. Right? Diseases, if you're in one, say you live in upstate New York, or you downstate New York, anywhere in New York, and you've lived there your entire life, and then you do your anthropology, you do your funding and your IRB and everything, you go out into the field, and you're in Southeast Asia. Your body's going to be exposed to an ecosystem that it's not familiar with, right? And there will be diseases, other things in the environment that you may not have any resistances to, that the native people may not even notice anymore, right? They get that, like, they get exposed to some virus in the jungle and they get a slight cold, and then they move on and they don't even think about it, and that same thing maybe can put you in the hospital, right? Disease, and you try to prepare for that as best you can, but there are always things you can't quite prepare for. Now, the thing off to the right-hand side is a bot fly. If you're interested in that, look up bot flies. Again, I'm not going to get into a whole story about that. We won't worry about it. The point is, things can come up, may not even kill you, but they may freak you out and send you home. Anything that interferes with your field work is a problem. Headhunter I used as a sort of a proxy for interpersonal violence, and I'll refer you to the Chagnon piece in thinking about that. Major points were that, if we're used to law and order in the Western world generally, we have police, we have judges, we have legislators that make the laws, we have 3 whole branches of government that all deal with laws. We're a law-intensive society, right? You go out into the Amazon or Southeast Asia or into the Kalahari Desert, they don't necessarily have that intensive a legal structure or any legal structure at all. Right? So interpersonal violence is in many cases on the table, whereas it's not in a state-level society. Right? Yes, the definition of the state that I'm going to give you much later in the course is a political entity that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within its boundaries. Meaning normal people can't just use violence on a day-to-day basis legitimately. That's not necessarily true when you leave state-level societies. Right? So once again, I'm going to point you toward Napoleon Chagnon and the role of violence, although I mentioned the controversies associated with him, and you can take that as you will. But the fact that there was the possibility of interpersonal violence, basically on a daily basis in that group. Any kind of work that's possible. Once you get out of Western state-level societies, there may be interpersonal violence. Right? The whales things was idiosyncratic. It was a weird thing that happened, and it was just evidence of the fact that you can't predict what's going to happen. And it is a story. If you ask me later in office hours or something, I'll tell you all about it. But basically, that was sort of a one-off weird situation. Something came up people didn't expect. State violence. That's another thing that may or may not be predictable, and that's when the state turns against you. Now, when you do ethnographic work, you're supposed to get permission from the place that you're trying to work. Right? So whoever's in charge of that area, whatever state's in charge generally, and we'll deal with the difference between different forms of government later on when we talk about politics. But a state, that's what we think of as countries. So you go to whatever country's involved, and You have to have permission from them to be there. Now, I'll tell you just briefly a part of one of the stories. I knew one person who was going to do work in a country. She got all of her permissions. She went through the U.S. Embassy, as I recall, got permissions from the appropriate ministers in the government, and then got on a plane, went there, and within 2 weeks, the government collapsed. Civil war had broken out, and the person who signed her permission to be in the country had been executed. Right, she's at a high risk for state violence. She could have been taken, thrown in prison. Many other horrible things could have happened to her. She fled for the border. She reformulated her whole project in cooperation with her advisors and her funding agencies and everyone, and did the work in a different country as a result. State violence is no joke. It's actually much worse than interpersonal violence as a rule, right? I mean, interpersonal violence, if you can't get away from it, is bad. But state violence, the state will get you if they want to. State's a big organization. It's easier to avoid 1 or 2 people than it is to avoid a state apparatus trying to find you. So, state violence can definitely crush your field work and get you killed. All right, psychological issues, we talked about culture shock and going native. So, both of them have to do with isolation, and I pointed out that isolation isn't just like the Tom Hanks talking to a volleyball thing on the desert island where there's nobody around and you're going crazy. But isolation can have different weird forms, and it can happen when there are plenty of people around. It's just you can't relate to them exactly. So culture shock, that's something that Chagnon talked about. But we have to bear in mind that Chagnon was writing in 1968. That was the publication date for the piece that I gave you. And he was basically just describing being shocked. He came from Cambridge and went to the Amazon, and so it was shocking the degree of difference in behavior. That's not culture shock as we understand it today. It was back then, but today we think about culture shock as a cyclical phenomenon. So first phase is the honeymoon phase, right? You go into a new environment, and usually people are so focused on the things that are new and interesting that they don't really think about how things are different and difficult. All right. Sorry, there's a phone going off in the background. So the novelty, in other words, offsets the difficulty of the new environment. And usually it takes about 2 to 3 months for that to wear off. All right, so you go into a new environment, everything's new and interesting, it's great, and yeah, everything's difficult, but who cares because all this is new stuff and new is fun. Then about 2 or 3 months go by and you realize, wait a minute, I live here, and all these people who were new and different a month ago are just people. And more to the point, they're people I don't understand fully, either because of language barrier issues or because even if they're speaking the same language, they have a different culture than you, right? So whatever they say may have different meanings in their culture, and you can't keep up with every single thing that's going on. So you're frequently surprised by things. Things don't always work out the way you're going to expect them to, and usually people get depressed, right? So they have a depression phase. So honeymoon phase, things are getting better and better and better, and then they kind of crash because you realize you live somewhere and people are annoying everywhere you go, and then you kind of learn some more information. Maybe your cultural competence increases and you go back up and you have a second honeymoon phase, right? And then so you're happy and happy and happy. Maybe you make some friends, you get happier, and then you realize, wait a minute, I live here and it's still not as easy as where I came from, and you get depressed again, right? So this can go on indefinitely. And if you think about people who just move from one culture to another permanently, it could go on throughout their entire life. It could also plateau, right? So they could go have a honeymoon phase and then a crash, and then a honeymoon and a crash, and then they just kind of plateau somewhere in the middle and stay that way and get used to living there. Still, they're going to be an outsider. Remember, we talked about enculturation and acculturation during the culture part of the lecture, that green set of slides. And if you've been enculturated in one culture and you move into another one, you're always going to be a little bit behind native people in understanding that culture, even if you work at it throughout your entire life in most cases. Right? So even if you completely move to another place and plateau out, still you probably will not be considered a native ever, during your lifetime. So, all right, going native is the next thing. Obviously, you can see how isolation plays into culture shock. You feel you can't connect with people around you, whether it's because of language or culture or some other thing. You feel isolated. Even if you have 1 million people around you, you can't connect to any of them, you're isolated. Psychologically, that's how it feels. Going native, again, there were a lot of stories of got kicked around during this, and I asked the students all if they experienced it, and I think a couple people in each section had been out of their native culture for a period of time. So that's the stuff that you miss not being in the class, and that's why this class took so long, actually. Right, it's gonna be the video should be a lot shorter than the class, just because we spent a lot of time talking about it. We talked about the stories I told. Some of the students had stories, so it was an interesting time for everybody, I suppose. And it's also good in terms of understanding the nature of these things. Right? Whenever there are stories in class, whether I'm telling them or whether I'm getting students to share what they know, the purpose of that is to sort of fill out the experience of, we're learning a bunch of terms. We want to put them as close to reality as we can. So if I can fit them into a student story, that's great. If I can fit them into a story that I bring, that's good too. But it's even better if I can fit it into a student story. It's good. A lot of times people know about these things. They just don't put them in those same terms. That's all. So anyway, that's a lot of what went on in class. So we talked a lot about culture shock and people's experiences. Going native. Going native, I always point people to a piece of literature and a piece of film that are closely related. Heart of Darkness by Conrad, and Apocalypse Now, which is a film that was based on Heart of Darkness. Right, totally different environments, but the same story, basically, the same characters. And it's a famous story of someone on a journey and another person who was in a different point in the journey and went native in relation to a native population. I'll talk about the Apocalypse Now version. Right, Marlon Brando played Colonel Kurtz. Kurtz was the one of the main characters that went native in both of the stories. It's called Kurtz in both stories. In the film version with Marlon Brando, he was Kurtz, and he was a U.S. military officer in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and he basically defected to the Viet Cong. Right, he went out there and he started identifying more with the enemy than he identified with the people who sent him there. Now, in anthropological terms, going native is what happens when you over-identify with your subjects. Right? And again, I had some stories about this. But the basic idea is you go out there, you meet a bunch of different people, you live with them for a period of time, and you kind of lose your bearing on reality, right? You lose track of where you came from, and you start thinking you're part of their culture, and like it's a little bit like Stockholm Syndrome, although you're not kidnapped by anybody. All right. So going native, you over-identify. Both of these things can interfere with your field work. Right. Obviously, the physical danger stuff, you can see how that would stop your field work. Psychological issues, culture shock. If you get too depressed in those depressions, you may go home. You may just push the button and get out of there. Going native, in that case, you may actually lose your bearing on reality entirely, and that'll interfere with your research. If you're over-identifying with your subject, and your subject isn't writing dissertations or writing research papers, then you may just forget all about that and get wrapped up in what you're doing. This is a form of isolation, too. You feel isolated within the culture, so you over-identify, and then you become isolated from your native culture. Right? So these are psychological issues that can be associated with leaving your culture and going into a new foreign culture. Right? Again, we're leaving out a lot of stories, but those are the main things that may turn up on an exam. Bye-bye, botfly. Okay, this is all the whale stuff. We can get rid of that. It's a jail. All right. Methodological problems. There are two major phases in getting a research project off the ground. Right? First, you have to do all the stuff in the university. So you have to read a lot of information. Some of it's field reports, ethnographies, things like that. Some of it's highly theoretical. You have to understand all this theory. You have to be able to manipulate it. You have to be able to apply it to a question in the real world that makes some kind of sense to you, makes some kind of sense to your advisory committee. Makes sense to your funding agencies, your IRB. Everybody has to understand how this fits in. That requires a certain skill set, right, and a certain temperament as well. You have to spend hours, days, years in libraries with your nose in books and articles and things like that, and dealing with politics internal to the universities, and that's a certain skill set. Now, when you actually go out there to do the work, you need almost the opposite skill set, right? You have to, first and foremost, you have to establish rapport with some of your informants. You have to find informants. Find anybody who will talk to you. Establishing rapport. Rapport is a technical term they use for establishing some level of trust with somebody in the environment who's going to give you information. And that person is called an informant or cultural consultant. Right. So if you go out there after being hugely successful in the university environment and you can't make any friends, you can't get along with people, you can't get anybody to trust you. You're not going to get the information you need to do the study that you're doing. All right. So, other thing that is psychologically important once you get out there is being able to adjust to changes. One thing that's sure is no matter how well you plan your ethnographic research or anything in life, really, some things are going to go wrong. And since in the small, if you aim small, you miss small, but you're aiming big when you go out to do an ethnographic project for a year, and small mistakes can turn into a big deal. So you have to be able to kind of roll with those things on the fly. Some things you can ignore, other things you can't ignore. Like when the government collapsed, when that other person went out to do research and got basically kicked out of the country or driven out of the country. That was as big a change as you can imagine, and that kind of thing can come up. It doesn't have to be that dramatic to be that big a deal in terms of your research. All right, so you have to be flexible. You have to get along with people and be flexible. That's kind of different from the environment in the university. We have to be fairly rigid in terms of understanding hierarchy and dealing with all that stuff, and disciplining yourself to go and read a whole bunch of stuff, most of which is fairly dry. Some of it's very interesting, but some of it's just you got to slog through it and get that information because you need it. So being able to go from one environment to the other is that's an unusual set of problems. Right? So the thing can fail at any of those points. You may fail at the university stuff, never get out into the field. You may fail at the funding staging, never get out there. You may get out there and not be able to make any friends and not be able to deal with an unexpected thing that came up, and any of that may interfere with your research. Right. The guy in the middle of that bench is Bronislaw Malinowski. I don't know the names of the other guys on the other sides, but he's on Papua New Guinea, so there's some folks that live in Papua New Guinea. And he's hanging out with him because that was his research site for years and years and years. He was doing a longitudinal study there. Malinowski, got on the next page here. First name Bronislaw Malinowski. He was originally Polish, born in 1884, died in 1942. I believe it was the same year as Franz Boas. He was critical to the British School of Anthropology in the same way that Boas was to the American school. I think it's fair to say. Some people may argue, I don't know, but he was a major figure in British anthropology. Why are we talking about him here? Because we're talking about methods. And this is the end of the first half of the methods lecture where we talk about methods in anthropology specifically. Next, we're going to transition into anthropology and science more broadly. But here, this is wrapping up the anthropology part. And Malinowski is one of the people who established those standards early on. Again, look at his date frame, his frame of references in terms of dates, 1884 to 1942. So basically in the early 1900s, he was doing work, early to mid 1900s, he was doing work in Papua New Guinea and figuring out things and writing it down. Other people were doing work before that, but they didn't keep scrupulous notes of all of their methodology. Some of them did, but not to the degree that Malinowski did. He really wrote down a lot of stuff that became standard in the field. So a lot of the stuff we're talking about is stuff that Malinowski maybe he wasn't the first person to ever do, but maybe was the first person to clearly record. Right. So yeah, people still read things that he wrote a long time ago on methods. One of the things he's credited with is the discovery of seasonality as an issue in ethnographic work. Seasonality, this term, I may have thrown it out there earlier in the course, I don't know. But seasonality is kind of what it sounds like. We think of the four seasons, so we're talking about seasonality in terms of weather. I guess spring, summer, fall. In this case, we're talking about seasonality in terms of people's behavior. Right. Different things happen in cultures at different times of the year. So he realized this. There's a little bit of a story to go along with it, which I'll throw in. He realized that seasonality was an issue because he'd been doing work in Papua New Guinea at the same time every year, which coincided with breaks he had at the university. I believe he was at Cambridge. And so he'd just go, he'd spend his 3 or 4 weeks or whatever, and then he'd go home and he'd write about that. So he's doing a longitudinal study over a long period of time, but he was going back at the same time every year. And at one point, remember the early 20th century, World War I broke out. Right? He got stuck on the island. And when he got stuck on the island, he realized he was missing a whole range of behavior that happens throughout the year just because of the timing of his visits. And from that point forward, he established the idea that in order to account for seasonality, the first research that an anthropologist does should last an entire year. I mentioned that earlier, said I'd explain it later. Now I'm explaining it. Right. Malinowski got trapped on the island, realized that you're missing out on a whole range of information if you don't stay for a full year because of seasonality. So from that point forward, and to this day, your first research is meant to take an entire year. So as I said before, in passing, you have to be able to go out into the field and sustain yourself for a year. It's a fairly expensive undertaking. In any case, seasonality is attributed to Malinowski. A lot of the other method stuff is associated with him as well. All right, so we'll break that one there. This should be a fairly short one. I think it ran about 20 minutes. And we'll pick up on the third section. Hopefully we'll get that all into one. All right. Thank you very much. We'll stop there.